Berlin, 1955. 20 feet beneath the Soviet sector, British and American engineers dig in silence. Above them, Red Army patrols roll past. Guard towers scan the horizon. Below, inch by inch, a tunnel extends toward 3 cables carrying every Soviet military transmission in East Germany. The West is flying blind. Nuclear arsenals are growing. Moscow's intentions are a black box. The only way to know what the Soviets are planning is to listen. Operation Gold would become the most ambitious eavesdropping project in history. A tunnel 1,476 feet long, stretching under the most militarized border on Earth. For 11 months, Western intelligence recorded over 40,000 hours of enemy communications. Generals, diplomats, and spies speaking freely on lines they believed were secure. This is the story of how MI6 and the CIA built the impossible, heard their enemies' secrets, and the twist no one saw coming. Understanding Operation Gold requires understanding the world that made it necessary. By 1953, Berlin had become the most dangerous city on Earth. The former German capital sat deep inside Soviet-occupied territory, divided into 4 sectors, controlled by the victorious Allied powers. The Western sectors, administered by Britain, America, and France, formed an island of capitalism surrounded by communist East Germany. The Eastern sector belonged to Moscow. The border between them was not yet a wall, but it was already a fault line where 2 nuclear-armed ideologies pressed against each other. Western intelligence was losing the information war. Soviet espionage networks had penetrated deeply into American and British institutions. The Cambridge Five had compromised MI6 for decades. Communist sympathizers had passed atomic secrets to Moscow. The Soviets understood Western capabilities and intentions with uncomfortable clarity. The reverse was not true. The USSR was a closed society, paranoid and compartmentalized. Human sources inside the Soviet system were rare, difficult to recruit, and frequently unreliable. The West was making decisions about nuclear strategy, military deployments, and diplomatic negotiations based on guesswork and fragmentary evidence. The stakes could not have been higher. Both superpowers possessed weapons capable of destroying civilization. A miscalculation, a misread signal, a moment of paranoia could trigger annihilation. Military planners needed to understand Soviet intentions, capabilities, and red lines. Without that understanding, deterrence was a gamble rather than a strategy. The solution lay beneath the streets of Berlin. Soviet military and diplomatic communications flowed through landline cables buried in the eastern sector. These cables connected Moscow to its occupation forces in Germany, its embassies across Europe, and its intelligence services coordinating operations worldwide. Much of the traffic was encrypted, but a significant portion traveled as clear voice. Officers speaking to officers. Logistics coordinators arranging supply shipments. Intelligence personnel discussing operations. If the West could physically access those cables, they could hear the Soviets thinking out loud. The concept had already been proven. In 1949, MI6 had successfully tapped Soviet communication lines in Vienna through a short tunnel dug beneath the city streets. Operation Silver demonstrated that physical cable interception was possible without detection. But Vienna was neutral Austria, lightly guarded and politically ambiguous. Berlin was different. The target cables lay deep in Soviet-controlled territory, surrounded by military installations and security patrols. The engineering challenges were immense, the risks were existential, but the need was undeniable. The West had to hear what Moscow was saying, and there was only one way to do it. The plan came from men who believed impossible operations were simply problems that had not been solved yet. Bill Harvey ran the CIA's Berlin station. He was aggressive, paranoid, and brilliant. a former FBI agent who had helped expose Soviet spies in America before joining the agency. Harvey believed in bold action. He distrusted caution and despised bureaucratic timidity. His Berlin base had become the most aggressive CIA station in Europe, running agents across the Iron Curtain and probing Soviet defenses for weaknesses. Peter Lund came from MI6. He commanded Operation Silver in Vienna, the successful tunnel tap that proved cable interception was possible. Lund brought operational experience and technical knowledge that the Americans lacked. He understood the engineering requirements, the security protocols, and the patience required for subterranean espionage. The two agencies had different cultures and competing interests, but they shared a common need. Neither could execute an operation of this scale alone. CIA had the funding and technical resources. MI6 had the expertise and established networks in Berlin. Together, they could attempt something neither would risk independently. The target was identified through a combination of agent reporting and technical analysis. 3 cables ran along Schonefelder Chaussee in the Alt-Glienicke district of the Soviet sector. 1 carried military traffic for Soviet forces in Germany. 1 carried communications for intelligence services. 1 handled administrative and diplomatic transmissions. Tapping all 3 would give the West access to virtually the entire Soviet apparatus in Eastern Europe. The engineering challenges were staggering. The cables lay approximately 1,500 feet from the nearest point in the American sector. Reaching them required a tunnel of unprecedented length for an intelligence operation. The soil beneath Berlin was sandy and prone to collapse, requiring specialized construction techniques. The tunnel would pass directly beneath Soviet observation posts and patrol routes. Any noise, any surface disturbance, any hint of underground activity would trigger investigation and likely armed response. The proposal went to the highest levels of both governments. CIA Director Alan Dulles reviewed the plans and authorized American participation. MI6 Chief Sir John Sinclair approved British involvement. The estimated cost exceeded $6 million, an enormous sum for a single intelligence operation. Both directors accepted the risk. The potential intelligence value justified the investment. The project received 2 code names. CIA designated it Operation Gold. MI6 called it Operation Stopwatch. Compartmentalization was absolute. Fewer than 50 people in both countries knew the full scope of what was being planned. In December 1953, senior officers from both agencies convened in London to finalize operational details. Every aspect was discussed: construction methods, cover stories, tapping equipment, personnel selection, security protocols, contingency plans. The meeting included representatives from technical branches, station chiefs, and planning officers. Among those present was George Blake, a rising MI6 officer assigned to the Berlin desk. The conference concluded with agreement. The operation would proceed. Now they had to build it. The first requirement was a plausible reason to be there. The American sector border with the Soviet zone ran through the Alt-Glienicke district, a stretch of unremarkable ground near warehouses and industrial facilities. CIA acquired a plot of land adjacent to the border and began construction of a large building complex. The official cover story identified the facility as a radar station and equipment depot for the US Army Signal Corps. Military installations were common in Berlin. Another warehouse complex attracted no unusual attention. The building was deliberately oversized, far larger than its supposed purpose required. The extra space concealed what mattered. Inside, shielded from external observation, engineers constructed the vertical shaft that would become the tunnel entrance. Trucks arrived daily carrying construction materials and departed carrying something else entirely. Tons of sandy Berlin soil, excavated from beneath the warehouse floor, hidden under tarps and disposed of at sites across the American sector. Construction began in early 1954. The initial shaft descended straight down from inside the warehouse, invisible to anyone outside the perimeter. Engineers used a specially designed steel liner to prevent the sandy soil from collapsing inward, a technique adapted from mining operations. The shaft reached the required depth without incident. Then the horizontal dig began. The tunnel extended 6 feet in diameter, large enough for workers to move freely, and eventually house the sophisticated equipment required for the tap. Progress was measured in feet per day, rather than yards. Workers operated in shifts around the clock, rotating through the confined space in a rhythm designed to maintain momentum without exhaustion. Noise discipline was absolute. Sound travels unpredictably through soil. A careless clang of metal, a shouted instruction. Even normal conversation could propagate to the surface and reach the ears of Soviet patrols walking their beats overhead. Workers communicated in whispers when they communicated at all. Tools were wrapped in cloth to muffle impact. The silence underground was as engineered as the tunnel itself. The technical challenges multiplied as the tunnel lengthened. Air quality deteriorated rapidly in confined underground spaces. Engineers installed a ventilation system with fans specifically designed for silent operation, pushing fresh air through the tunnel and extracting carbon dioxide before it accumulated to dangerous levels. Lighting was strung along the ceiling to allow continuous work regardless of the hour. A narrow rail system with rubber-coated wheels permitted quiet transport of equipment and debris. The tunnel walls were reinforced and lined with sandbags to absorb sound and prevent collapse. Temperature control proved unexpectedly critical. The tunnel had to remain stable regardless of conditions on the surface. Berlin winters freeze the ground. Berlin summers bake it. Either extreme could crack the tunnel lining, shift the soil, or create condensation that would damage equipment. Air conditioning units maintained constant conditions throughout the dig. The most dangerous phase came when the tunnel crossed from American territory into the Soviet sector. At that invisible line beneath the earth, the operation transformed from ambitious construction project to active penetration of enemy territory. There was no legal authority, no diplomatic cover, no plausible excuse if discovered. Workers were digging under hostile soil while Soviet guards walked overhead. Engineers monitored constantly for any indication of detection. Seismic sensors registered vibrations from above. Acoustic equipment listened for sounds of investigation. Observers watched the surface through periscopes concealed in the warehouse. The tunnel reached its terminus, 1,476 feet from the warehouse entrance, directly beneath Schönefelder Chaussee, where the 3 target cables lay buried. Total construction time approached 8 months of continuous work. At the end of the tunnel, engineers constructed the tap chamber. This room would house the equipment necessary to intercept Soviet communications. Accessing the cables required the most delicate work of the entire operation. Engineers dug upward from the chamber toward the buried lines, careful not to break the surface or disturb the road above. British Post Office technicians, experts in cable technology who had been brought in specifically for this phase, prepared the tapping equipment that would connect Western intelligence to Soviet secrets. The tunnel was complete. Now they had to listen. The tap went live on May 11, 1955. British Post Office engineers completed the physical connection to the first cable using induction coils placed around the lines. The technique was elegant in its simplicity. Electrical signals traveling through copper wire generate electromagnetic fields. Coils positioned close enough to those wires pick up the fields without requiring any physical cut into the cable itself. The Soviets would see no damage during routine inspections. Signal quality would remain unchanged. The tap was designed to be invisible. Within hours of the connection, The first signals began flowing into recording equipment positioned in the tap chamber. The initial intercepts confirmed everything the planners had hoped for. Soviet voices, speaking Russian, filled the headphones of the technicians monitoring the feed. Military officers discussing troop deployments. Logistics personnel coordinating supply movements between bases. Administrative staff handling routine communications that revealed the bureaucratic machinery of occupation. The conversations were mundane and extraordinary at the same time. An officer complaining about equipment shortages. A supply coordinator confirming delivery schedules. A clerk reading back personnel transfer orders. Each exchange was ordinary Soviet business, the kind of routine traffic that flows through any military organization. But each exchange also revealed something: unit designations, commander names, equipment types, location references, the texture of daily operations that intelligence analysts could weave into a comprehensive picture of Soviet capabilities. The processing operation ran continuously from the moment the tap activated. Raw intercepts flowed from the chamber through cables running back through the tunnel to the warehouse above. Inside the warehouse, banks of recording equipment captured everything. Magnetic tape reels turned around the clock, technicians rotating them in shifts to ensure nothing was missed. Field reels were packaged and shipped to processing centers in London and Washington, where translation teams waited. The volume was overwhelming from the first day. 3 cables carrying traffic for an entire occupation force generated more material than analysts could process in real time. Prioritization became essential. High-value traffic, conversations involving senior officers, references to intelligence operations, discussions of strategic planning received immediate attention. Lower priority material was logged, archived, and queued for later analysis. Nothing was discarded. Even routine logistics chatter might contain details that would prove significant when combined with other sources. Security protocols governed every aspect of the operation. The tap chamber was staffed by small teams working in shifts, entering and exiting only through the tunnel to avoid any surface activity that might attract attention. Communication between the site and headquarters used secure channels with limited transmission windows. Knowledge of the tunnel remained restricted even within CIA and MI6. Officers who processed the intelligence often had no idea where it originated. By summer 1955, Operation Gold was fully operational. All 3 cables were successfully tapped. Military traffic, intelligence communications, and diplomatic transmissions flowed west in an unbroken stream. London and Washington received daily summaries of intercepted material. High-priority items went directly to senior officials who had authorized the operation months earlier. The impossible had been achieved. Western intelligence was listening to the Soviet military speak. The harvest exceeded every projection. From May 1955 to April 1956, Operation Gold recorded over 40,000 hours of telephone conversations. The teletype traffic added approximately 6 million hours of additional material. The raw intercepts filled 50,000 reels of magnetic tape that required dedicated processing facilities in both London and Washington. Hundreds of translators and analysts worked on tunnel material for years after the operation ended. The last transcripts were not completed until the early 1960s, half a decade after the final recording. The military intelligence alone justified the operation's cost many times over. The intercepts provided detailed order of battle information for Soviet forces stationed in East Germany. Unit designations, troop strengths, command structures, equipment inventories. Western planners had spent years estimating Soviet capabilities through satellite photography and fragmentary agent reports. Now they had confirmation. They knew which divisions were stationed where. They knew what tanks and artillery those divisions possessed. They knew the names of commanding officers and the relationships between units. Logistical communications proved unexpectedly valuable. Supply requests revealed shortages and vulnerabilities. Maintenance reports indicated equipment readiness levels. Transportation coordination exposed deployment timelines and movement patterns. The bureaucratic chatter that filled most of the recordings painted a detailed portrait of how the Soviet military actually functioned, not how it presented itself in parades and propaganda, but how it operated day to day with all its inefficiencies and constraints. Training exercises were monitored in real time. Western analysts listened as Soviet units conducted maneuvers, hearing officers critique performance and identify weaknesses. Tactical doctrine that had been studied only through captured documents and defector testimony became audible. The exercises revealed how Soviet commanders thought about warfare, how they communicated under stress, and where their training fell short. Political intelligence flowed alongside military traffic. Communications between Soviet officials in Berlin and their superiors in Moscow revealed internal debates about occupation policy. Assessments of Western intentions showed how Moscow perceived NATO strategy and where Soviet analysts believed the alliance was vulnerable. Personnel discussions identified rising figures in the military and intelligence hierarchy, information that would prove valuable for years as those officers advanced to senior positions. The counterintelligence value was immense. Soviet intelligence officers used the same communication lines as everyone else. The intercepts exposed operations across Europe. Agent networks were discussed. Communication protocols were revealed. Methods that the KGB and GRU had developed over decades became visible to Western analysts. Armed with this knowledge, counterintelligence services identified Soviet assets and disrupted operations that might otherwise have continued undetected for years. The strategic impact reached the highest levels of Western governments. Intelligence derived from Operation Gold shaped assessments of Soviet strength during a critical period of the Cold War. It informed decisions about NATO force deployments, nuclear targeting, and arms control negotiations. Senior officials in Washington and London received regular briefings based on tunnel intercepts, often without knowing the source. The material was considered so reliable that it influenced policy debates at the cabinet level. Operation Gold was not a single successful intercept or a lucky break from a well-placed source. It was sustained, industrial-scale intelligence collection maintained for nearly a year under the most difficult operational conditions imaginable. The engineering worked flawlessly. The security held throughout the operational period. The analysis delivered actionable intelligence that shaped Western strategy. By any reasonable measure, it was the most successful eavesdropping operation of the Cold War. Perhaps the most successful in history, the tunnel had proven that technical audacity, combined with operational discipline, could penetrate even the most heavily defended target. The West was no longer blind to Soviet intentions. For 11 months, they had listened to their enemy think. Then, on April 21st, 1956, Soviet soldiers began digging above Schönefelder Chaussee. The end came on April 21st, 1956. Soviet and East German signals personnel began excavation work along Schönefelder Chaussee shortly after midnight. The official explanation was routine cable maintenance following reports of signal degradation. Technicians dug down toward the buried lines while military personnel secured the area. Within hours, they had uncovered the tap chamber. The tunnel was exposed. East German soldiers entered the chamber and followed the tunnel back toward the American sector. They found the sophisticated equipment, the recording apparatus, the ventilation systems, the carefully constructed infrastructure that had operated undetected beneath their feet for nearly a year. The discovery was documented meticulously. Photographs were taken. Evidence was catalogued. Soviet commanders were notified immediately. Moscow recognized the propaganda value instantly. Western journalists were invited to tour the tunnel entrance. Photographers captured images of the sophisticated eavesdropping equipment and the passage stretching toward American territory. The pictures appeared on front pages around the world within days. Soviet officials delivered statements condemning the operation as Western aggression, a flagrant violation of East German sovereignty, and proof of American and British espionage activities. The tunnel became an international incident. East German media devoted extensive coverage to what they called the gangster tunnel. Guided tours brought selected visitors to see the evidence of capitalist treachery. The propaganda campaign portrayed the discovery as a triumph of socialist vigilance over Western subversion. Moscow milked the exposure for every possible diplomatic advantage. The American and British governments declined official comment. Neither confirmed nor denied involvement. Diplomatic channels handled inquiries with studied ambiguity. But behind closed doors, the mood was not panic or recrimination. It was quiet satisfaction. The tunnel had operated for 11 months and 8 days. It had captured more intelligence than the most optimistic projections had anticipated. The recordings were already being processed. The analysis would continue for years. Whatever embarrassment the discovery caused was vastly outweighed by what had been achieved. Internal reviews at both CIA and MI6 reached the same conclusion. Operation Gold was a success by every operational metric. The engineering had performed flawlessly. Security had held throughout the collection period. The intelligence value was incalculable. The only question that remained was how the Soviets had found the tunnel. Cable maintenance seemed a plausible explanation. Random discovery was possible given the duration of the operation. 11 months was a long time to remain undetected beneath enemy patrols. No immediate evidence suggested compromise from within. That conclusion would hold for 5 years until a name surfaced that changed everything. In 1961, George Blake was arrested by British authorities on suspicion of espionage. Blake was an MI6 officer with an impressive career. He had served in Berlin, Vienna, and London, holding positions that gave him access to some of the most sensitive operations in British intelligence. He was respected by colleagues, trusted by superiors, and considered a rising star in the service. Under interrogation, he confessed everything. He had been working for the KGB since 1951. For a decade, he had passed British secrets to Moscow while climbing the ranks of MI6. Among his betrayals was Operation Gold. Blake had attended the December 1953 planning conference in London, where senior officers from CIA and MI6 finalized the tunnel operation. He sat in the room as engineers discussed construction methods, as intelligence officers identified target cables, as security specialists outlined protocols for protecting the source. Within days of that meeting, Blake passed complete details to his Soviet handlers. Moscow knew the tunnel's location, its purpose, its timeline, and its technical specifications before a single shovel broke ground. The revelation raised an obvious question. If the Soviets knew about the tunnel from the beginning, why did they allow it to operate for 11 months? The answer was counterintelligence calculus. Blake was more valuable to Moscow than any single operation. He had access to ongoing MI6 activities across the world. He could identify British agents, expose future operations, and provide insight into Western intelligence priorities for years to come. Shutting down the tunnel immediately would have revealed that someone inside the planning group had talked. The circle of knowledge was small. Investigation would have been intense. Blake might have been exposed. Moscow chose to sacrifice communications security to protect their agent. They allowed the tunnel to function, accepting that genuine intelligence would flow west while preserving their mole inside MI6. Soviet intelligence took precautions where they could. The most sensitive communications were routed away from the tapped cables when possible. Certain operations were protected. Certain personnel were warned. But they could not sanitize everything without revealing their knowledge. The bulk of the traffic that flowed through those cables was real. The military logistics, the order of battle information, The counterintelligence material that Western analysts spent years processing represented genuine Soviet communications that could not be faked. Blake was tried and convicted in 1961. He received a sentence of 42 years, among the longest in British legal history. In 1966, he escaped from Wormwood Scrubs prison and fled to Moscow, where he lived until his death in 2020. His betrayal was profound, but it did not undo what Operation Gold had accomplished. The intelligence mattered regardless of what Moscow knew. Even with Soviet awareness, the tunnel produced material that could not be faked or sanitized without disrupting the very military operations it supported. Troop movements happened on schedules that could not be disguised. Equipment inventories reflected real capabilities. Logistical constraints revealed genuine vulnerabilities. The Soviets could protect their most sensitive communications, but they could not fabricate an entire occupation force's daily traffic without creating contradictions that would expose the deception. The West gained a detailed picture of Soviet military capabilities in Eastern Europe that informed defense planning throughout the late 1950s. Analysts continued extracting value from tunnel material for years after the tapes stopped recording. Intelligence assessments written in 1960 still cited intercepts captured in 1955. The harvest outlasted the operation by half a decade. The technical legacy proved equally enduring. Operation Gold demonstrated that large-scale signals intelligence collection was possible even in the most hostile environments. The engineering techniques developed for the tunnel influenced subsequent operations in ways that remain classified. The processing infrastructure, the translation pipelines, the analytical methods created to handle the volume of intercepts became templates for future programs. When satellites and electronic surveillance expanded Western collection capabilities in later decades, they built on foundations laid beneath the streets of Berlin. Hundreds of engineers, technicians, translators, and analysts contributed to Operation Gold. Most remained anonymous, their work classified for decades. They built something unprecedented under impossible conditions and maintained operational security throughout. A single traitor had compromised the secret, but he could not erase what their discipline and skill had achieved. Operation Gold revealed a truth about intelligence work that remains relevant. Even compromised operations can succeed. Even betrayed secrets can yield value. The Soviets knew about the tunnel and still could not prevent it from delivering genuine intelligence. Audacity, combined with engineering excellence, had produced something that treachery could diminish but not destroy. For 11 months, a tunnel under Berlin gave the West a window into the Soviet mind. What they built endured. What they accomplished mattered. If this story of Cold War audacity, engineering brilliance, and the shadow of betrayal fascinated you, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss when we investigate the operations that shaped history. Drop a like if you appreciate the research behind these stories. And here is your question for the comments. If you were running MI6, would you have proceeded with the tunnel knowing any insider could betray it? Or is that risk simply the price of every bold operation? Let us discuss that below.